Hello friends, since getting back into Darkest Dungeon recently, I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about what I hope to see in the sequel, which is still slated for early access release this year. Spoiler warning for the original game, going forward by the way. So, Darkest Dungeon is leaving some big boots to fill. Aesthetically, artistically, and gameplistically, it's one of the most impressive games ever to come out of an indie studio, and I do not say that lightly. And Red Hook have been exceptionally cautious with revealing details in the sense that they haven't done that. But here's what we know so far. Firstly, most importantly, Wayne June is reprising his role as the narrator, and that's actually really interesting when you think about it. He's a great voice actor, obviously, but he wasn't just the narrator in Darkest Dungeon, he was the ancestor, strongly implied to be the player character's own future self. I'd love to see the story of Darkest Dungeon 2 tie back to the kind of purgatorial time loop of Darkest Dungeon 1 somehow. Although in DD1 we never got to break that time loop, that was the whole point. Maybe I'm reading too much into that and they just got Wayne back because he was A, super popular, and B, the only voice you ever heard complete words from in the entire game. The teaser released last year though, titled A Glimmer of Hope, has an interesting quote. "This is not a time for heroes. Look instead to those battered souls who have known fear and failure in ample portion, but rise again to reclaim a glimmer of hope from the spreading stain of the darkest dungeon." Couple of things here I love. Firstly, the quote goes out of its way to refute the heroism of the mercenaries in Darkest Dungeon. That's something I talk about often myself. That tells me they've not changed narrative focus away from that idea, which is what I think made Darkest Dungeon so special in the first place. Our heroes are not. Secondly, there's the evocative phrase, the spreading stain of the darkest dungeon. Does that mean that ultimately we failed to contain the heart of darkness? I mean, yeah, that was always the point. Along with the devs claiming that DD2 won't be about dungeon crawling, but instead, a grueling journey. That leads me to think we're in for a more traditional RPG narrative with the aesthetic of Darkest Dungeon. Flippin' love that. I want a version of Final Fantasy X where Tidus goes slowly insane hearing voices from beyond the stars, and Yuna has to sacrifice her own sanity to preserve his, and yeah, I guess I could just play FF7 again. But like I say, Red Hook have revealed almost no information yet, other than strategically timed teasers to remind everyone they're still working on it. I respect that a ton, so let's look at what I think should be changed from Darkest Dungeon 1. There's not a lot. So firstly, tooltips. I've talked about this before. Let's see if we can find a good example. The tooltips in Darkest Dungeon are like super unhelpful. At best, really, and misleading at worst. Stats are worded in confusing ways, and strange orders, and this is coming from a Path of Exile player, and there's often no indication at all which allies can be targeted with buffs, like Cry Havoc. I still can never remember who this targets. I'd like to see them stripped down, made more consistent. Debuff tooltips are actually wildly misleading for new players in Darkest Dungeon 1 as well. 5 Blight for 6 turns very often means 5 Blight for 1 turn, 3 Blights for 3 turns, 1 Blight for 1 turn. It's not good. Secondly, a bunch of quick-fire nitpicky things about preparing for an expedition. If that's still a thing you have to do in Darkest Dungeon 2, who knows? I think there should be an option for trinkets to unequip after every expedition, just automatically. I think that if you select a mission, select this one, and then go back to town, when we embark, it's back at this one again. I think the game shouldn't go back to highlighting the default mission that it wants you to do. I would like to also see loadout buttons to auto-buy certain provisions for each zone. Button here that just says Cove, and it automatically buys whatever you have set that you want to buy in the Cove. So none of these are really big or important, but if you're not fixing quality of life stuff like that in a sequel, I feel like you've dropped the ball as devs, and I don't think Red Hook have ever dropped the ball. I would like to see rebalanced and new classes, but I think that's a gimme. I really like the class identities in Darkest Dungeon 1, but I'd like to see more done with, for example, the Vestal. For a game so obviously based on Dungeons and Dragons, they really captured the fact that nobody likes clerics, but you gotta bring one along anyway. More diversity in terms of healing classes would be lovely. Vestal and Occultist are both fine, and Arbalist is surprisingly competent as a healer, but it just gets a bit stale when almost every lineup has to have one of them. I would also like to see some form of out-of-combat healing. It was always a glaring issue in Darkest Dungeon 1 that the Vestal could heal anyone at will in combat, but gets lazy the second the pressure's off. And you know, that's pretty much it, I think. Darkest Dungeon 1 was a wonderful game. No surprise to anyone who's followed this channel for any length of time that I think that. There are a bunch of little things I'd love to see change, but apart from that, just more of the same, please, Red Hook. More of the same. So thanks for watching. If you'd like to see me put my money where my mouth is, I'm going to start streaming over on Twitch in the very near future, so there's a link in the description for that. Cats are nice. Catch you later.